I'm Sarveshi Shukla, and this is Chicago Indian Arts Podcast. Conversations that take India seriously as a living, layered, imaginative place. A platform was built with the belief that Indian literature, arts, and culture deserve a serious home. Our guest today has spent her entire career at the intersection of medicine, story, and the inner lives of children. Dr. Sayantani Dasgupta is a pediatrician, a narrative medicine scholar at Columbia University, a New York Times best-selling children's author, and one of those rare people who can write about Bengali demons, colonial politics at the museums, the multiverse, all in the same breath. Her publisher has described her work as Bengali folktale and string theory inspired, and being all of it, it is great fun for kids as well as me, an adult, all included in one. Her Kiranmala and Kingdom Beyond books gave brown children something they had been waiting for. A girl from New Jersey who discovers she is an interdimensional Bengali princess, fights Rockosh demons, rides flying Pakiraj horses, and figures out who she is. And her new book, The Theft of Ruby Lotus, out from Scholastic this April, is a museum heist set at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Kids, do not get any ideas. It's a genuine honor to welcome Dr. Sayantani Dasgupta.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. The honor is mine.
We have a wonderful conversation planned today, and I cannot wait to get into it. So first and foremost, where I wanted to start with you was you've spent your career doing many, many different things. You've listened to children as doctor. You taught adults how stories shape healing. And then you wrote books where brown children get to fight demons and stand at the center of an adventure. When did you realize that those three things were actually the same thing?
I love that question. Thank you for asking. I often say that my career has been at the intersection of the stethoscope and the pen. And I really see all of my the phases of my career, being a pediatrician, being a classroom professor, and being a children's author, as all being interconnected by health. So when I, saw patients in my clinic, I was, tasked with their physical health, their corporeal health, and sometimes their emotional health as well.
Of course.
In the classroom, I think our purview, our task is really primarily the intellectual health of our students. And then as a children's author, I think, it expands all of those things. I think children's literature, yes, is about health, writ large. It's about intellectual health. It's about emotional health. But fundamentally, it's also about imaginative health. And I think being able to see oneself represented, not just literature in general, any kind of literature, but literature in which you, your family members, your community members, and for that matter, your neighbors, people unlike you, are represented. That's a way of expanding and enriching our imaginations and our imaginative health. In other words, who do we see as a hero? Yeah. Who do we see, as beautiful? Who do we see as centered? These are all questions of stretching our imaginations and being able to include all of us in the big question of us. And so, to me, even though people say, oh, you've had these really three disparate careers, to me, it's all really been about health. And I think that pediatricians around the country who still are in practice, I don't see patients anymore, will agree because, when I was in pediatric practice, I would write prescriptions for reading. Read to your child 20 minutes a day, and then you give that family an age-appropriate book. And when I was doing that, I don't think I realized that I myself would be on the other side of that prescription one day. I would be writing the books. But to me, it is all connected.
This is incredible how you framed it. And the one term you just used, I've never heard it, and it's so critical. You said imaginative health. In the day and age that we are in right now, we, I think, see a a significant decline in that, but I couldn't have framed it in the manner that you did. I would love for our people to, keep that term with them. Imaginative health is so, so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, of course, it's hard to be what you can't see,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you grew up in Ohio and New Jersey, not exactly Bengali heartland, but your childhood trips to Kolkata gave you the stories. There's something very specific about growing in an immigrant family where stories at home are beautiful, enormous, vivid, but they're not marketable in school. You couldn't exactly bring a Rakosh to a show and tell. Was there a moment where these stories stopped feeling like a secret and came to the forefront for you and became a superpower?
That's a beautiful question because in my first series, the Kiranmala and the Kingdom Beyond series, her family stories are like a roadmap, right? Guiding
Yes.
her to not
Yes.
just her origins, but kind of the source of her strength, which really is accepting and integrating all the parts of her identity. And I think that's what you're asking
Yeah.
about. So I myself have an immigrant daughter. I write a lot about kind of that immigrant experience or the, next generation immigrant experience where my parents were post 1965 immigrants. There weren't a lot of us, as
Of
you
course.
said so rightly, which was both different. It was both isolating, but it was also interesting because when I look back on that day, that time, I realized that among the Bengali communities, because there were so few of us, we were all together. So be it, Bangladeshi Muslims and Bengali Hindus from India, we recognized our commonality. We had meals together. We celebrated both Durga Puja together and Eid
Eat.
together. So there
True.
really was that kind of integration. And then more broadly, my parents' community included people, Tamilians and Kannadigas and, Punjabis and people from everywhere.
Right.
And so in a sense that, being an early immigrant, it was both isolating and it broke down barriers in many ways. And I think my parents were also very, very aware that that wave of immigration owed a lot to the activism of African Americans, right? Who
Right.
had, in this country, I think the civil rights movement was a big reason that post 1965 immigration laws changed. And so many of us were able, to have our families come. And so, in a sense, it both, allowed for that connection making to be seen as well as it was a, somewhat lonely experience. As I, became an adult in this country, and as I had my own children, because I was a pediatrician, because I was, an academic, and I wasn't a children's writer until later in my career, I can really say that it wasn't until my own children were having the same experience of not seeing themselves in literature that I had. So when I was young, in the 70s, in the 1980s, I did not see anyone who looked like me represented in books, in movies, on posters, nothing.
Right.
And I figured 30 years later, as I had my own children, that the situation would be different.
Right.
And as it happens, it wasn't actually that different. And my own children, when, who are young adults now, when they were becoming big readers in that golden age of children's literature, they were reading, let's say, Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, some of the early books, right? Artemis
Right.
Fowl. And they said, we love these books, Mama, but where are the kids who look like us?
Absolutely.
And so it wasn't really until my own children were experiencing that same, what I call narrative erasure, right? That
Right.
invisibility in literature.
Right.
And I always make the case that narrative erasure is a kind of psychic violence,
It
right?
is.
Not to see oneself represented gives you the message, and it gave me the message really clearly. Maybe there's something wrong with you. Maybe
Right.
people like you don't deserve to be
To be,
considered
yeah.
heroic or beautiful or, the protagonist. And when I saw my own children having that self-same negative experience, that's really when I said, okay, I'm going to reach back to if Rick Riordan can do it, I can do it. I can reach back to my grandmother's folk tales. I can put them in a modern context, put some humorous spin on it and write stories at the bedside for my children. And at the time that I wrote my first book, I really did not think I was going to publish it. I thought it was a family activity.
Oh,
But it took a generation for me to really see how painful and violent that had been. Not being able to see myself as a child had been so painful and violent
right.
that I didn't want my own children to have that experience, or anybody's children,
Right.
anybody else's children coming up behind me.
You've touched so many things in what you said just now, and I personally resonate with everything you mentioned. The fact that, we don't see our kids or their names or that kind of stories told, it goes in the psyche. And you're absolutely right. Yes, it used to bother me earlier. It always bothered me how Indians were generally stereotyped everywhere. In any portrayal of them in the West would be so narrow, and they would pick like even the smartest person shown on screen or in a book would be a socially inept person. And it's such a narrowing view of who we are as a culture. So I mean, first of all, I'm beyond thankful to you and to writers like you who actually made that change. And so glad that you didn't keep it limited to it being a bedside story for your kids. It became for everyone and for each one of us, because I feel proud when my kids are reading it and when they read names which are complex but they have a history and it means. And I've had those conversations as my kids are reading these books a lot more than if I was trying to just simply inculcate culture in them. So it is you're doing a very important work, and I'm
Oh,
personally thankful for you doing this.
oh, thank you so much. And I just want to mention, there are so many more of us now. It's not ideal. It still needs to get better, but there's
Yes.
so many more diverse writers in the middle grade and young adult space and,
Yes.
children's space in general. But because of organizations like We Need Diverse Books,
Yes.
which came about in 2015, and I feel like really opened the door for so many of us.
I
And so I
agree.
just want to kind of make a nod to, things aren't necessarily, equality isn't necessarily always given. It has
No.
to be demanded. And so
Yes.
organizations like We Need Diverse Books did that important work.
Wonderful. Great organization. When I was researching about the podcast today, I came across it. I didn't know about it earlier, but I'm so proud that, something like that exists. And to your point, it is very critical for all of us to know that we are not caricatures and there's so much more that is being written about us. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for bringing up that organization to our people. So you became a doctor. John Hopkins, pediatrics, public health, many people who go into medicine kind of leave humanities behind. Like that doesn't become a center for them. You've written about narrative humility, the idea that a doctor can never fully master a patient's story, that right stance is not about certainty, but ongoing listening, and that this really matters when you think about race, diaspora, and whose stories get flattened. For someone hearing this for the first time, our audience, our listeners, can you give us a simple way to understand narrative medicine and what it changes?
Sure. So I always say that, my one kind of elevator pitch line is that narrative medicine is the scholarly and clinical endeavor to honor the role of story in the healthcare encounter. And so the idea is that we human beings are fundamentally storied creatures, right? We understand ourselves and each other from time immemorial through story. And if that is the case, then at moments of crisis, illness, trauma, tragedy, those stories are more critical than ever because at those moments, we as human beings tell new stories to make sense of,
The
something that's
world.
changed in our life.
Yeah.
And so we need to have people who are expertly skilled in eliciting listening to, interpreting, and acting upon those stories, particularly at moments of illness and crisis, etc. And so, narrative medicine in general says, we shouldn't, in the same way we would never graduate somebody from medical school who kind of knew their anatomy or had a passing familiarity, with drugs, pharmacology. We should never graduate somebody who is not rigorously trained in understanding and interacting with story, because story is such a central part of healing, right? It's such a central part of, both the experience from the teller's point of view and the listener's point of view. And so that's kind of my, nutshell take on it, is that if we can take an English PhD student off the street, as it were, and teach them metaphor, diction, form, temporality, whatever, have them read, I don't know, Chekhov or, Dostoevsky or what have you,
Yeah.
Virginia Woolf. Similarly, we must be able to take a medical trainee of any kind, nursing school, doctor, chaplaincy, physical therapy, what have you, and train them in attending to the story of a suffering other and attending to someone else's kind of deep life-changing experience, which is oftentimes what's happening. Now, the little twist I've given on it is, around 2008, I wrote an article that I'm probably best known for in the field, around this issue of narrative humility, which is, despite all of what I've just said, and all the training and all the rigor and all the attention, still every single human being has elements to them which will remain unknowable despite our best efforts. And so we cannot ever assume that we know everything there is to know about somebody. We can't assume, as one doctor actually said to me once when I was experiencing an illness, he said, "You don't have to tell me. I know exactly how your story ends."
Oh, wow.
And so, right?
Okay.
Wild, true story. But, we can never assume that. We never know how someone else's story ends. And so narrative humility is this idea that, yes, we are ethically engaged with another person's story, but at the same time, we recognize our own prejudices, frames of listening, limits of listening. As one of my students so beautifully put it, try to understand, realize you'll never completely understand, try anyway.
Wow.
Right? Try to understand, realize you'll never completely understand, try
And
anyway.
Try it anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
How cool is that? In fact, that reminds me. So, as I was telling you before we started today, my husband's a physician. And anytime, we've had this conversation, whether it's about our kids or others. And I ask him, what do you think? Like, he'll look at someone and he'll be like, they'll make a great doctor. And I was like, what makes you say that? Like, I can't tell. And one of the biggest thing he says is this, that, how intently are you listening and how heard does your patient feel? That, that is such a key skill amongst all the other things, of course, your medical knowledge and degree and everything. But so, it's so fascinating to hear that, you've placed it at the center point of what makes a good doctor, what will stay with the patient, and ultimately the story is theirs. I was listening to you talk almost as if I'm listening to your podcast, and I'm just like, yeah, I want to keep hearing this. It's a topic on its own, and one day we should explore, that part by itself.
I'd be delighted. I'd be delighted.
Kiranmala books, as I read them with my kids, they're genuinely funny. There are times I'll crack up with, everything that's going on there. The Rakosh are terrifying, but they're ridiculous at the same time. And her attitude, like I told you earlier, she has that quirkiness that I find in my daughter. It's so real written, that they have, she'll give me attitude. Obviously, she's a 10-year-old now, but at the same time, she's genuinely funny. How do you hold humor and seriousness in a space for a child reader without the book becoming like a lecture or a lesson to them? How do you do that?
I have so much kind of love and respect for young people and young readers, and that's why I became a pediatrician, right? It makes a lot of sense in all the choices that I've made in my life. But the one thing I think about young people that we as adults need to maybe get back to and remember, or two things actually. One thing is that I think young people have a really clear moral compass, and especially now more than ever, that sense of like, but
Right.
no, whether or not it's inconvenient, whether or not the powers that be don't like this is wrong. That sense of like, nope, this is right, this is wrong, or this is fair, this is not fair. If you want real clarity of kind of moral vision, go to an 8 to 14-year-old. As I'm sure sure you know from your kids. They're like, well, that's not fair. Why is that? Right? And they're kind of showing like, duh, isn't that obvious? That's not fair. We shouldn't do things like that.
True.
And so I love that. And I feel like when writing for young people and being able to visit schools and work with young people, it keeps me in touch with that clarity, that moral clarity, that I think is also really important in medicine, right? It's really important to have that sense of, well, I don't care if it's inconvenient to the insurance, like this is the way we should do the thing, right? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, I just came off of a week of touring around the country with my latest book, and I was able, because of Scholastic and many independent bookstores around the country, to go and visit schools. And the thing that always strikes me when I visit students in schools is there's this kind of membrane thin line that young people have between absolute absurdity, like the ability to like be giggling and rolling on the floor and talking about boogers and snot and whatever. And then like on a dime to switch and ask the most fundamentally like philosophical questions about humanity. Like someone will be making a joke and then someone else will turn to me and say, but miss, don't you ever get nervous speaking in front of, like, how do I not be, or miss, you said your parents are immigrants, my parents are immigrants. These are real questions, by the way.
Yeah.
My parents are immigrants. Answer me this, how do I make my immigrant parents proud, but also myself proud?
Wow.
And on a dime, I think that, both the humor and ebullience and joy and silliness of life, and the kind of fundamental, heartfelt human questions that we all ask.
Yeah.
Children have access so quickly, I think, to both. And they haven't been kind of socialized or shamed out of them. And, as we grow up, there's such a kind of shame around being earnest or a shame around being heartfelt. And I love that young people, like the 8 to 14-year-old crowd, doesn't really have that. They're like, well, no, of course I'm going to like giggle about snot and then also ask this like earth-shattering question that's going to make, the author cry who's like come up to see us.
Yes.
So yeah, I love it. And I also, I was raised by my father in particular, was very, very funny. And I think when you're an immigrant and when you're an immigrant kid, there are a lot of hardships that are going to come your way. And you can either, let them make you bitter or let them crush you, or you can kind of approach them with humor. And I think that's the model that I always saw. And my own father, he passed away very recently, but he was a detective novelist in his later life, and his detective Ikin Babu, who's like on Hoichoi, and there's movies now out, 5 or 6 movies now out of this character. Seems like he's absurd and he's very silly, but he notices everything. And so that's the reverse of the child who on the surface is silly, but inside sees. So this is an adult who's that way. And so I feel like that model for like retaining your childish, kind of joy and ebullience with the world while still being so insightful is something that I really value.
That is beautiful. And I mean, the way you described the kids, that's literally, I feel moment to moment. That's what I live with. It'll be something so silly. Something fell down and they can't stop giggling. And then it is, about profound topics of the world. And I'm like, can I not switch this quickly? Like, need to be somewhere in between. But that's beautiful experience you shared. Another part that you just shared, and I kind of want to go in a little deeper in it, about your father and the experience there. So, not so long ago, I also lost both my parents, and I lost them unexpectedly. It was very sudden. And it broke me in ways I didn't understand and I couldn't fathom. When I read your publisher's weekly article and you mentioned that, your dad's sudden passing and he being your career's, number one cheerleader, like he's very happy with what you were doing and your fan. Like you starting to write, you said it kind of was return of your own heart to you. I found that amazingly inspiring. Like I choke as I think about it because it's so hard. Grief is very hard, and you changed it into something so meaningful. I'd love to know more. I would love to, hear that experience and how did you do it?
Sure. I mean, I think that first of all, I'm very sorry for your loss as well. Grief is losing people you love is terrible in any circumstance, but certainly you and I share that very unexpected, like there was no preparation, there is no anticipatory grief.
No.
It's just one day to the next, gone.
Yeah.
They're gone. And your plans are gone, and just the way you conceive of the world is gone. And in a sense, especially, losing a parent, no matter what age, you feel like the anchor under your feet is gone, right?
Right.
The rug's been pulled out from under you, right?
Right.
And so it's so destabilizing, besides being, the person isn't there, but also your fundamental sense of self is gone, right? Suddenly. And that was my experience as well. And so, and I happened to be writing this book. It had been under contract from before. So I had proposed a heist book and slightly different version of a heist book, and it had been under contract. And so I was in the midst of writing it, and it was a mess. It took me 4, 5, not just rewrites in terms of these characters, no, different characters, different plot, different setting. It was a mess. I had never had an experience like this, and it happened to be that I knew my editor. This is the 12th book I've done with her. And so she knew me well enough to kind of hang in there with me, and she knew what I was going through. And she was like, nope, this isn't working. Do it, how about this way? How about that way? And finally, when I finished writing a serviceable draft, finally, of this book, I didn't even recognize it. A friend of mine said to me, oh, so in my book, the story of Theft of the Ruby Lotus, just for your listeners who may not be aware of it, it's about a kind of reverse museum heist where some young New York City immigrant daughters decide to, one of them finds this ruby in a package in the mail addressed to her mother. And she becomes convinced, for various reasons that we can talk about, that her mother perhaps has been involved in this theft. And she's like, oh no, this is terrible. This is why she's lost her job at the museum. I'm going to reverse heist this ruby back into the museum and clear my mother's name, and everything will be well. And the ruby in my fictional, book, the fictional ruby in my fictional book, is taken from the hilt of a sword who was inspired, of a kind of Indian warrior queen inspired by the Rani of Jhansi. Now, in my book, I've just made up a character,
right.
But it is inspired by the Rani of Jhansi. And so somebody on reading my book said, oh, that's a metaphor for you and a metaphor for grief. And I said, well, how so? The Rani of Jhansi, Indian warrior queen, rode with her baby and on her back. I didn't see the connection.
Yeah.
And they said, no, you're like the sword. You look strong. You look, capable on the outside. And I did, probably.
Yeah.
But the heart of you has been plucked out. And in my book, I call it the heart of the ruby lotus,
Right.
the heart of the lotus ruby. And so the ruby is actually called the heart of the lotus. And it's been plucked out of the sword. And she said, you look intact, you look strong, but your heart has been plucked out of you. And it really struck me that so often art gives us what we didn't realize we needed, but we needed. Right? Did I know that I was writing? I didn't. Subconsciously, maybe somewhere in me, some part of me knew, but consciously I did not know that I
Right.
was grappling with grief in this way. And, that in writing this story, I would, feel like somehow my heart was being somewhat
Channeled
mended, right?
somewhere.
It's never mended fully, but
Of
somewhat
course.
mended. But I really think that that's what, I mean, I can only write, speak about writing because that's my art form, but I think it's undoubtedly true with all forms of art. But, we write things so we figure out what we're feeling. We write things so we get the answers to the questions we didn't even know we were asking,
Yeah.
right? And so in this way, I think the subconscious works when we create art in ways that feel mysterious, that feel like we didn't even know we were doing it. And so in a sense, did I know that I was grappling with grief when I wrote that way? I
Probably
didn't.
not.
I consciously didn't. I didn't
Yeah.
consciously decide,
Right.
but some part of me did. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of how this book and think about it. This book is ultimately about how do we remember those who are gone,
Right.
whether or not it's people in our individual lives or cultures that have passed, right?
Yes.
How do we honor the treasures of those who are no longer with us? And that can be museum ethics, but it can also be like, how do I treasure my father's teachings, right? It can
Right.
be very personal or collective. And did I realize I did not realize I was writing that. I didn't, but somehow, the book then becomes a mirror and you get your own kind of experience reflected back to you.
Right. This is this is beautiful because subconscious channeling in a manner that is so entertaining to read, but it is channeling a part of you that's so serious is I think so much to learn from there. And that brings me to the question about the theft of Ruby Lotus. Just the premise itself is so fascinating. I cannot wait to read it with the kids. Like museum heist at the Met, mysterious Ruby, girl moving through one of the most iconic museums in the world, trying to figure out what something is worth and who it belongs to. A heist gives a child everything: speed, danger, clues, the thrill of being, smarter than the adults. But underneath that, you're asking a deeper question about repatriation. Who owns cultural objects when history has moved them through unequal hands? I cannot tell you how fascinated I am as to how do you carry something that complex without losing the sense of adventure and fun for kids. So please tell us more about, that aspect and angle of this.
Of course. No. I mean, I think when you write for young people, again, it's back to like my enormous respect for young people's ability to hold the serious and the silly together. And also, I think my primary responsibility as a writer for young people is to tell a great story. And if I'm not telling a great story, if I'm trying to lecture at them or be didactic or shake my finger, then I'm not actually a writer. I'm something else. I'm a moralizer. I'm something else. If you're a writer, you're meeting your reader where they are. And the 8 to 14-year-old reader is in a place where, please, the 8 to 800-year-old reader is in a place to, where fun, characters, plot, all of these things drive a story, right?
Yeah.
Humor, it drives a story. If within that, I can then kind of weave these more fundamental human ethical questions, that's how I like to do it. Like that's always my favorite methodology. Um, Story first and foremost, theme after that. Absolutely theme. Like story without theme is like cotton candy, right? It's too sweet, it's too thin.
Yeah.
But theme without story, that's like a brick, you have to bite
Right.
into. Both need each other. Um, so that's kind of always my methodology is a fun, fast story with a, theme, kind of woven through it. I'm a big museum fan. I've always found peace at museums. And in fact, speaking of mourning, there's this beautiful book where a former, All the Beauty in the World, where a former Metropolitan Museum guard talks about museums as
Yes.
respite, right?
Yeah.
Respite from society, where time and space work differently. You can travel the world, you can travel through the centuries, all in the course of an afternoon at a museum. Museums are these places where beauty is housed, that you can step out of the hubbub of society and kind of, feel
Feel.
yourself, feel your emotions. And all of these things are beautiful, but museums are also, colonial crime scenes, right? And I don't think I realized that until I was an adult. I
Yeah.
went to plenty of museums with my family, with my kids, with schools, what have you. But I never actually, especially as a young person, asked the question, well, wait a minute, where
Where
did
did
all
you
this
get
stuff
that?
come from? And why is it here?
Yeah.
And did you ask permission? And have you had a conversation,
Right.
and is it upside down? Like, have you talked to the community that it's stolen from? Like, is
Yes.
it correctly displayed?
Yes.
Is the
Yes.
information we're getting about it correct? All of those
Right.
questions.
Right.
And I wanted young people to have that information when they went to visit museums. And also, I feel like, art repatriation, it's a doorway into a broader question about colonialism. So this is both a book about art repatriation and a book centering immigrant kids and families.
Yeah.
And I think both of those things are very important because at the same time that, post-colonial powers are hoarding, colonial loot,
Yeah.
they are also telling immigrants from those same countries, no, 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 we don't want you. We don't want your kind here,
Yes. Yeah.
right? Kind of these fascist kind of political waves all over, Europe, North America, whatever, are saying we don't want immigrants here, but in the same breath they're saying, oh, but no, 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 we want all the
Keep your
precious stuff.
stuff. Yeah.
Right?
Leave your
Leave
stuff
your
and go.
stuff. Leave your stuff and go. Right? Um, and that's also complicated because they also want our
Of
labor.
course.
It's a
Yeah. Yeah.
longer
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
But I feel like art repatriation is a doorway into these broader questions of power inequity globally, how history impacts current day, immigrant communities' lives, anti-immigrant rhetoric. Like it really is, it's a small window for a
Into.
young person just beginning to think about this stuff,
Right.
into how all of it's connected, right?
Right.
Who treasures whom?
Right.
What part of an immigrant community is treasured? Are we always proving our worth? All of these kinds of questions I think are deeply interrelated. And it felt like an interesting entry point to have a broader conversation. Maybe now, maybe later.
Right.
Maybe the child reader reads a little bit now, digests a little bit now. Maybe as they grow, that little seed blooms and it
Right.
becomes something larger.
Right. And I think that's so right. Like it's about planting that right now. Like just have the curiosity. And how do you grow up in an environment where your culture is not appropriated to you by default, right? Like some things deep enough, and to do it in this way where they'll be entertained, they would love to read it and learn about something and have that curiosity is awesome. I think it's and more than anything else, I think it is very important because as a parent of kids who were born here, are growing up here, and that duality that they constantly witness, to give them a framework of, you can think about it this way as well, to help aid with the questions they are entitled to ask is a very important thing. So I love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
This brings me to our literature festival, which is on May 30th, and we are very sad that we'll miss you there in person.
Yeah, I'm so
I
sorry.
wish, but hopefully next year you'll have time, and we'll be able to have your presence there. There's a session that morning. There are some very interesting programming for us for the whole day. And morning session is very focused on children and families. And it's called Once Upon a Tale, storytelling, poetry, narratives for children and families. What would you say to an Indian writer, or Indian origin writer, or a doctor, or a parent, or an academic who has a story that they want to tell, but they don't quite feel that they have the permission to step into that fiction just yet?
Toni Morrison has that beautiful quote that I always share with everyone, young people, old people, adults, what have you. She says, if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So, if there's a book about a family like yours or a community like yours or an issue like this that you want to read and it's not out there, you have both the power, but also the responsibility to tell your story, to tell that story. And so I would, urge, anyone who is, yearning, often storytelling, it's like this building wave. Like I'll often feel it like a pressure in me, like I have to get the story out. So if you're feeling that sense to make your art, do it. Not just you have permission, but you have the responsibility for those of us, for those, young people coming up behind you. That said, I would also say, this is not an easy, quick process. It's about respecting the craft. It's about respecting your own growth process, no matter how old you are.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit of a sucker for being a student, as my career probably shows. And so I think if you are able to always, the wisest man is the humblest, right? And so if you always put yourself in that humble position of like, this is so exciting, no matter, I'm in my second decade, my 50, whatever, I'm in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, what have you. I get to be a student again. I get to improve my craft again. I get to, learn again. I think that's the other piece of advice I would say is, yes, you may be a doctor, you may have studied all these years to be a doctor, but now you get to be a beginner again as a writer, and embrace that. Don't expect that it's going to necessarily come quickly. That's okay. That's how you get better.
Yeah.
So I would say join a craft group, take a class, after you see your patients, doctor, or, find a critique group of people. We have book clubs, find a critique group, exchange pages with fellow writers. I would just say, both grab your permission. You don't have to wait for permission, go for it. But also be willing to learn your craft and improve.
Wonderful, wonderful. What a great message. So, not only do you have the power, it is your utmost responsibility to tell a story that's bubbling inside of you. I absolutely love that. In fact, that brings me to why we started Chicago Indian Arts. It is that kind of spirit that had been bubbling inside Jigar Shah, the founder of the organization, where, whenever he would look around or, whenever a bunch of us who were a part of this team got together, it was this, this vacuum where our stories were out there in a very caricatured, stereotypical way, or reductive narratives where, we're seeing it's a very, exported narrative that sells well. So cows, chaos, butter chicken, Bollywood, that's all us, right? And I was like, what are you
And that's
doing?
it. And that's it. Nothing
That's
else.
it. We have nothing more to it. And, so there were moments like I so profoundly remember when India successfully did its launch to, the space launch to Mars recently. It was presented in New York Times as a cartoon of a rustic old villager with a cow, and he's knocking on the door where all the elite scientists are sitting in like bow ties and all. And the subject, like the byline was, "Oh, India has arrived." And I was like, are you joking right now? Like, this is how you present it? And I think those reductive places is what we saw everywhere, that it's a certain thing that'll be amplified over and over everywhere. So the focus of this organization, our first festival, became that no, we want to tell India in all its richness. There's so much that goes on, there's so much behind us. Why are we falling into the trap of how it has been told to us?
Correct.
It's a responsibility that we have to help change. And Jigar says over and over that as this organization grows and, we build out more such things, he would want to see, my kids' generation, their kids, to be taking this on and continuing this process of learning and education and helping the world understand the nuances. So everything you said has been like, it just felt like this is the piece that, the puzzle piece that we've been waiting to hear. And, there you are.
Oh, thank you. Although, remember when that space mission happened? Like the contra image to that terrible racist cartoon that you just described was, do you remember how many scientists in saris we saw?
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Oh my God.
And like these badass women with their PhDs in their saris doing space research,
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Not proving, not having to have a whole PR proving anything. They are being themselves. And that's how my mom was.
And being brilliant simultaneously.
Exactly. Exactly. And in those, my mom was a working woman. My aunts have been scientists, researchers and all. And I suddenly saw that, I know all of these women in my life. That is how they were, very empowered, very strong. But that's not the image that ever gets out. So thank you for pointing that out. That is beautiful. In our festival, another thing that we've been very deliberate about is children's programming. And we kept asking this question, where do you go in a city like Chicago, which is considered to be a melting pot for encountering India in its full range: literature, language, memory, food, imagination, without it being reduced. And that's this conversation that we are having is such a, I am so thankful that you first of all, you agreed to do this on a very short notice and you brought all of this to us right now. It means a lot. It's our foundational year. And, people like you and your kind of literary caliber, it means a lot to us. So from all of us.
It means a lot to me. I mean, this is why I do the work, and this is, I'm a member of this community, right? And so this is why I write. This is why I do the work. So no, I'm grateful to you.
Thank you. So we have another interesting panel on that day, which I think you'd love to hear about. It's called Indica, and it's in that afternoon. And game designers, comic creators, people working on ancient storytelling, AI in the gaming world. So when you think about Kiranmala, about the Rakosh and Pakiraj finding their way into, when a kid picks up a book in Chicago, and then those kind of figures showing up in games and global media, what does it feel like to see, stories from your grandmother's era now making, strides in these directions? So tell me about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when I was first writing the Kiranmala books, I was really nervous because I thought, what if I don't do it justice? What if this is disrespectful? And then the way that I actually thought of it was I said, what, oral stories necessarily always change with the times, right? So when my grandmother's grandmother was telling these same stories, it was in a different era, and she was adapting them differently.
Yeah.
And then my grandmother, when she was telling me and my cousins these stories, inevitably, I don't know if this ever happened to you, but like if somebody had done something naughty that day, suddenly the lesson of the story, of this like ancient story, suddenly the lesson was like, happened to be the exact thing that whoever did wrong that day, like don't fight with your brother or like whatever was the story. So it became clear to me,
True.
oral stories change and they adapt with time. And that's their strength, right? That's the nature of them. And so to bring a story, overseas across the, oceans and to adapt it in, a US context now, wasn't disrespectful. It was exactly what oral stories are meant to do, which is be living, breathing things
Right.
that change, that are dynamic, and that answer the needs of the people who are listening to them and telling them. So, in that way, I love the idea of, Kiranmala being, or at least Bukiraja, Lala, Neil, the princes, being relevant characters for both South Asian American kids and all kids. Like, so the fun thing is I've landed up at schools where, a gaggle of little blonde boys who like ostensibly have nothing in common with Kiranmala will run
Right.
up to me and go, "Oh, I loved her. And so
Oh.
that is also changing the narrative, right, of
Yes.
who everyone sees as a hero and who everyone sees as worthy. So that's really exciting to me. We definitely have some possibilities, but as you know, things in Hollywood, take a minute. So there
Yes.
have been some possibilities of Kiranmala possibly coming either onto the big or small screen,
Love
maybe as an
it.
animated musical. We will see.
Love
So
it.
that's kind of in the works, and we will see what happens with that. So all of that to me is really exciting. Scholastic has like a character that they've made of the Kiranmala, character, and like she's in a little world that kids, with permission can go and play in. So all of that is absolutely delightful. My one kind of downer comment that I'm going to make right now is I have really strong feelings about generative AI
I can
because,
imagine.
like every single creator out there who I know, I have had every single one of my novels, not to mention scholarly papers and scholarly books also, taken without permission by
Ooh.
learning models and fed into without payment, permission, anything. And
Right.
so all of it I have extremely positive feelings about, except
Right,
except
right, right,
except
right.
the part where people are plagiarizing intellectual property, ruining the environment, doing global labor exploitation, for people who are
Right.
inputting this data. I have pretty strong feelings about that, I must say.
Right.
Do I think that there are smaller data sets of smaller computers with less environmental impact that can do amazing stuff like
Right.
detect breast cancer? What? Absolutely, as a doctor, absolutely. Do I really resent having a plagiarism machine shoved down my throat? I do.
Yeah. No,
So
I mean that is you're not wrong in feeling it that way at all, because I think, and I come from tech world, like my alternate life, I run a technology company. So I always tell people that we're in this hype and fear era, and it is not something where people fully understand consequences of things. So it's like, oh, when you get the next shiny object and you're just like elated about it, you've put morals and ethics and everything else on the side. Eventually this will calm down and people will be asking right questions. Don't know how quickly that'll be and how far gone will the world be. So it is something to kind of actively participate and change in. But this is a very critical point for sure. And we all, at least the people who have some ins and controls, we are at the surface of, should we be doing it? So, for my work, if I'm advising a client, I kind of always put that level of governance into play. But from a creator's lens, yeah, like, we wanted AI to take care of the more manual tasks that didn't require humans in their creativity? Why are we having them do the creative pursuits? So I get it. I hear you there. It's this thing. So I think our panel is more focused on the gaming world and bringing together the ancient characters into it, because like most of the gaming stuff that we see around today has been very focused on, the world stories. But we're full of our stories, but our gamers don't see that inside. So I feel that that's an interesting way, and we are very excited to bring that part out. But I'm with you on the AI. So as we're coming to an end on this, one of my questions for you is, for the child who's between languages, between lunchboxes, between home, what home says versus what the school sees, between a name no one can pronounce and the person that they're still becoming. On the Lit Fest day, when a child walks out of the kids' session, what is the one thing you hope they're carrying?
I mean, I hope that that child gets to realize it's never an either or, that in fact, there's a third world in which everything is possible, right? There's a third choice in which everything is possible, in which you get to be all of yourselves at the same time, in which you get to ask the questions, you get to correct somebody when they say your name incorrectly. You get, all of those things. And I think that that's the joy of work like this literature festival. It's saying, you know what, it's never been either or, and in fact, maybe it's a third whole new thing. Maybe it's not one or the other. Maybe it's something else that's even better. That's, that allows us to envision a space for all of us. And so when I talk about imaginative health, that's really what I'm, pointing to is, books are imaginative playgrounds. Storytelling is an imaginative playground. It's an imaginative gym, if you will, as is a literature fest. It's a place where we can envision the future that we want to see and that we want for all of us to be thriving and healthy in. And I think that that's what I hope for that child, is to be able to say, oh, wait a minute, I'm part of a larger story. I'm part of a larger story about tomorrow and a different story than one I've heard before.
How cool is that? I love that. This is awesome. Dr. Dasgupta, Sayantani, thank you so much. This has been a genuine gift for someone as accomplished as you in all the worlds that you've treaded. For you to, be on our show today, to be associated with our festival and our organization means a lot to us. Theft of Ruby Lotus is out from Scholastic, and it came out in April 2026. Kiranmala books are at every good bookshop. This is Chicago Indian Arts Podcast. The Chicago Indian Lit Fest is on May 30th at the Congress Plaza Hotel. Please join us there. We'd love to see you there. The details can be found at chicagoindianarts.org. This is me, Sarveshi Shukla, signing off for this week, and I'll see you guys soon again. Thank you.